Before diving into this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more compelling narratives with you. When I found my stepson Ethan in his room that day, I never anticipated how one simple act of curiosity would lead to something so exhilarating. It was a peaceful Saturday afternoon, the kind of day where the house felt both too quiet and yet reassuringly familiar. I had spent much of the morning immersed in chores, cleaning to occupy my restless mind. My husband had left for a last-minute golf outing with friends, leaving the house unusually tranquil. Ethan was upstairs, the faint hum of his music drifting down as I moved about the kitchen. Ethan, 22, carried himself with the self-assuredness of his age, but there was a reserved side to him that surfaced in unexpected ways. Over time, we had built a quiet but steadfast connection, not flashy, but genuine. After finishing the dishes, I poured myself a tall glass of iced tea and leaned against the kitchen counter, letting the late afternoon sunlight seep through the window. The serenity should have been soothing, yet a restless energy buzzed within me. Unable to ignore it, I decided to check in on Ethan. The soft strains of music grew clearer as I approached his door, which was slightly ajar, allowing slivers of sound and light to escape. I paused, debating whether to knock, but something inexplicable drew me closer. Gently I moved forward, intending to call out his name. Yet, as I peered through the gap, I stopped abruptly. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his posture at ease yet intent. His hands moved rhythmically, and his eyes were focused downward, a faint frown of concentration creasing his forehead. My breath caught as the scene before me clarified an intimate moment he clearly believed was private. I should have turned and walked away, granting him the privacy he assumed he had. Yet, I remained frozen, an odd mixture of surprise and fascination rooting me to the spot. There was a vulnerability in the moment the way Ethan was so immersed, oblivious to the world beyond his room. The room, bathed in the warm, golden light of the afternoon sun, seemed to amplify every detail, the contours of his face, the subtle curve of his shoulders. An unfamiliar curiosity stirred within me, an unspoken question I couldn't suppress. Before I could fully process my thoughts, Ethan's eyes flicked up, meeting mine through the narrow opening. Time seemed to stand still. His expression shifted rapidly from shock to embarrassment, and then to something indefinable. His hands stilled, and for a moment, neither of us moved, the shared silence stretching infinitely. I began, my voice faltering as my heart raced. Words failed me. Ethan was the first to break the tension, hastily reaching for a blanket to cover himself, his cheeks flushing a deep crimson. His movements were hurried, almost frantic, as though the fabric could shield him from the vulnerability of the moment. "I didn't think you'd come upstairs," he mumbled, his voice thick with embarrassment, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor, as if avoiding my eyes could somehow undo what had just happened. The rawness in his tone spoke volumes, revealing the delicate balance of his emotions, an intersection of shame, surprise, and something else I couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry," I stammered, my own face aflame. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The words tumbled out in a chaotic rush. Ethan raised a hand, cutting me off gently. "It's fine," he said quickly, though his voice trembled. Just give me a minute." I nodded, retreating down the hallway, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. My hands gripped the banister at the top of the stairs as I tried to steady my breathing. I shouldn't have lingered. I shouldn't have watched. Yet the image of Ethan, so exposed and unguarded, was seared into my memory. It wasn't just the physical aspect. It was the emotional rawness of his expression that struck a deep, unnameable chord within me. Lost in my thoughts, I barely registered the sound of his door opening. Ethan stepped hesitantly into the hallway, his movements tentative, his gaze avoiding mine. The air between us was thick with an unspoken tension, the echoes of the moment still reverberating between us. Neither of us knew it then, but that day marked the beginning of something that would evolve into an experience far beyond anything I could have imagined. He'd thrown on a t-shirt and shorts, his usual casual attire, but his flushed cheeks and the awkward tension in his posture betrayed his unease. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice quiet as he leaned against the doorframe. "I didn't mean for you to see that." "It's okay," I replied quickly, my own voice softer than usual. "I should have knocked. I wasn't thinking." He nodded, his eyes finally meeting mine for a brief moment, before darting away again. "I guess we're even now," he said with a faint, nervous chuckle. "Even?" I asked, tilting my head slightly in confusion. He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You've walked in on me. I've walked in on you. Remember last summer when you forgot to lock the bathroom door?" The memory hit me like a jolt, and my cheeks burned anew. I had completely forgotten about that incident, the fleeting moment of awkwardness that we had laughed off at the time. Back then, it had felt like nothing more than a silly mishap, easily dismissed with humor. But now, as Ethan's words hung in the air, they seemed to take on a different weight, as though they carried a deeper, unspoken meaning. "I guess you're right," I said with a laugh, though my voice still held an edge of nervousness, my thoughts churning with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. "We're even." The tension between us seemed to ease slightly, the shared memory acting as a bridge between the awkwardness of the moment and the easy familiarity we'd always shared. But even as we laughed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between us, a subtle, yet profound change that hovered like a whisper in the air, waiting to be acknowledged. It was as though the laughter carried a new weight, an unspoken understanding woven into the fabric of our connection, challenging the boundaries of what we had always known. This wasn't just a moment of fleeting levity, it was a turning point, quietly urging us to confront the fragile and complex emotions that had been lying dormant for so long. The laughter faded, leaving behind a lingering quiet that felt different from before. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed casually over his chest, but his posture still carried an edge of tension. I wasn't sure what to say, and for a moment, I considered retreating downstairs to give him the space I had so clearly invaded. But something in the way his gaze flitted toward me, hesitant yet searching, kept me rooted in place. It wasn't discomfort exactly. It was something softer, something almost vulnerable that made me want to stay. "Do you want to talk about it?" I said finally, my voice softer than I intended. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, his cheeks darkening as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Talk about what exactly?" he asked, his tone laced with nervous humor. I offered a small smile, hoping to ease the tension. "About anything. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I just thought maybe you'd feel better." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor as he rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know," he admitted after a moment. "It's kind of embarrassing." I took a step closer, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, as though I were approaching a skittish animal. "Ethan, it's okay to feel embarrassed. Everyone has moments like that." His lips quivered into a faint, self-deprecating smile. "Not everyone gets caught by their stepmom." The way he said it, half joking, half mortified, made me laugh softly, and to my surprise, his smile widened just slightly in response. "I guess not," I admitted, leaning against the opposite wall to mirror his posture. "But hey, if it helps, I've been in plenty of embarrassing situations too. You're not alone." Ethan looked up at me then, his expression softening. "Yeah, but you're always so composed, like you have everything together all the time." The comment caught me off guard, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name, a blend of vulnerability and self-awareness that I hadn't fully admitted to myself before. "I'm not as composed as you think," I said, my voice quieter now, the honesty in my words surprising even me. "Trust me, I've had my fair share of moments where I didn't know what I was doing. Sometimes, I still don't. It's just easier to hide it." He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly, as though he were trying to reconcile the image he had of me with the person standing before him. "It's just weird," he said finally, his voice almost contemplative. "You're so different from Dad. Not in a bad way, just different. It's like you see me in a way he never could." The words lingered in the air, heavier than I expected, and I found myself searching for the right response. "Different can be good," I said softly. "Sometimes, seeing someone from a new perspective helps us understand things we never realized before." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I settled for a soft, "Different can be good sometimes." Ethan nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "I guess it can." The silence stretched between us again, but this time it felt less heavy. I could see the tension in Ethan's shoulders easing, the faint lines of worry around his eyes softening as he leaned back against the doorframe. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said after a moment, his tone more sincere now. "I wasn't really thinking. I guess I just forgot you were home." "It's okay," I said quickly, hoping to reassure him. "Really, it's not a big deal. I just want to make sure you're okay." Ethan nodded, though he still avoided my gaze. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just, I don't know. It's hard to explain." I tilted my head slightly. My curiosity piqued. "Hard to explain how?" He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, his eyes darting toward me, and then away, as though afraid to hold my gaze for too long. "It's just, being around people is hard sometimes, you know? Like, I always feel like I'm supposed to be a certain way, and when I'm not, it feels like I'm doing something wrong, like I'm disappointing someone, even if they don't say it out loud." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and I felt the weight of his struggle settle in the space between us. His words hit me harder than I expected, an ache blooming in my chest as I realized how deeply these feelings must have been rooted. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him he wasn't alone, but all I could do in that moment was reach out, hoping the gesture would speak louder than my faltering words. "Ethan," I said softly, taking another step closer. "You don't have to be anything other than yourself. You don't have to meet anyone's expectations, not mine, not your dad's, not anyone's." He looked up at me then, his eyes wide and searching, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerability he usually kept hidden. "You really think that?" "I know that," I said firmly. "You're a good person, Ethan. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." The corners of his mouth twitched into a faint smile, and I could see the tension in his posture easing even further. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're welcome," I replied, my own voice soft. We stood there for a moment longer, the silence between us feeling almost companionable now. I could see the faint traces of a smile lingering on Ethan's lips, and I felt a sense of relief that he seemed to be feeling better. But even as the tension eased, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. The way he looked at me, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long, made my heart flutter in a way I didn't fully understand. Slightly, I waited for him to continue. "About not needing to meet anyone's expectations," he elaborated. "I guess I've spent so much time trying to be what other people want me to be, that I don't even know what I want anymore." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I set my mug down carefully, afraid that my shaking hands might betray me. "Ethan," I said softly, "it's okay to feel that way. You're still figuring things out, and that's normal. You don't have to have all the answers right now." He nodded slowly, his eyes finally meeting mine. "But what if I'm scared to figure it out? What if I don't like what I find?" The raw honesty in his voice made my throat tighten, and I had to take a deep breath before responding. "It's okay to be scared," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "But you're stronger than you think. You don't have to face it all at once. Take it one step at a time, and trust that you'll find your way." Ethan's lips twitched into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," I admitted, my own smile tinged with sadness. "But you're not alone. I'm here for you, no matter what." For a moment, he just looked at me, his gaze steady and searching. The vulnerability in his expression was almost too much to bear, and I felt a strange pull in my chest, an ache I couldn't explain. "Thanks," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to thank me," I replied, my own voice soft. "That's what family is for." Ethan nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful, as though there was something else he wanted to say. I waited, giving him the space to speak, but the moment passed, and he took another sip of his tea instead. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, weighted with unspoken thoughts and emotions that neither of us seemed ready to address. I wanted to reach out, to offer him some kind of reassurance, but I wasn't sure what he needed, or if he even knew himself. Finally, Ethan straightened up and set his mug on the counter. "I think I'm going to head to bed," he said, his tone light, but tinged with an edge of hesitation. "Okay," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night," he replied, his gaze lingering on me for just a moment longer, before he turned and disappeared up the stairs. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after he left, my thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and longing. The weight of the day pressed down on me, and I felt a strange mix of emotions, worry, tenderness, and something deeper that I couldn't quite name. As I climbed the stairs to my own room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something had shifted between Ethan and me, something unspoken, yet undeniable. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I knew it would only grow stronger with time. He was doing the same as when I came into his room the previous time, but this time it seemed like we both did not care that it was happening. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked softly, leaning against the door frame. He shook his head, offering a small, tired smile. "No. Too much on my mind, I guess." I nodded, understanding all too well. "Me too." For a moment neither of us spoke, the silence between us filled with the quiet hum of the lamp on his nightstand. The air seemed to pulse with unspoken words, a thick and heavy tension wrapping around us like an unseen cord. I wasn't sure how to break it, or if I even wanted to. It was as though we were standing on the edge of something profound, both hesitant to take the next step, but unable to pull back from the precipice. Every small sound, his steady breathing, the faint creak of the bed as he shifted seemed amplified, filling the space between us with an almost deafening quiet that begged to be filled. "I've been thinking," Ethan said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "About what?" I stepped further into the room, closing the door behind me. Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. "It's just hard to believe sometimes. I feel like I've spent my whole life trying to be what other people want me to be, and I don't know how to stop." His words hit me like a wave, and I crossed the room to sit beside him on the bed. "Ethan," I said softly, placing a hand on his arm, "you don't have to figure it all out right now. It's okay to take things one step at a time." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of uncertainty and something deeper, something that made my heart skip a beat. "What if I don't even know who I am without all of that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I squeezed his arm gently, my own emotions swirling as I tried to find the right words. "You're still you, Ethan. The expectations don't define you. You're more than that, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Ethan's gaze lingered on mine, and I could feel the weight of his emotions in the air between us. "You make it sound so simple," he said, his lips curving into a faint, wistful smile. "It's not," I admitted, my voice quieter now. "But that doesn't mean it's impossible. You're stronger than you think." For a moment, the silence returned, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the soft hum of the lamp casting a gentle glow over the room. It was as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of us in this shared moment. The intimacy of the quiet was profound, each unspoken word weaving a connection that felt both fragile and unbreakable. I could hear the soft rhythm of his breathing, steady yet carrying a hint of unease, as though he was on the cusp of saying something he couldn't quite articulate. The glow from the lamp cast gentle shadows on his face, highlighting the contours of his features, making him seem both vulnerable and resolute. It was a moment that felt suspended in time, delicate and fleeting, yet carrying the weight of something undeniable. "Thank you," Ethan said finally, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," I replied, my own voice soft. But even as the tension eased, I couldn't ignore the way his eyes lingered on mine, or the way my own heart raced in response. There was something unspoken between us, something I wasn't sure either of us was ready to confront. Ethan shifted slightly, his hand brushing against mine as he adjusted his position. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver through me, my breath catching in my throat. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said quietly, his gaze dropping to our hands, where they now rested side by side. "You'll never have to find out," I replied, my voice trembling just slightly. Ethan looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine as though seeking an answer to a question he couldn't voice. There was a rawness in his gaze, a plea for reassurance or perhaps understanding, and it held me captive. I could see the weight of his unspoken thoughts, the quiet battle he was fighting within himself, and I felt a deep pull to offer him the clarity he seemed to need. The room felt impossibly still, the air between us charged with an energy that was both exhilarating and terrifying. And in that moment, I knew that nothing between us would ever be the same. The fragile thread of our relationship had shifted, weaving us together in ways I hadn't anticipated but couldn't deny. The unspoken connection we had always shared now felt amplified, alive with a depth and intensity that made my chest ache with both fear and a strange, exhilarating anticipation. This wasn't just a moment, it was a turning point, a quiet declaration that neither of us could return to the way things were before. The realization was as daunting as it was thrilling, and as I held on to that thought, I knew we were stepping into uncharted territory, together. Ethan's hand remained close to mine, and the silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of emotions neither of us could put into words. Finally I spoke, my voice trembling. "Ethan, are you okay?" He hesitated before nodding slightly, his gaze dropping again. "I don't know. I just feel like I'm standing on the edge of something, and I don't know what to do next." I reached out, gently placing my hand over his. "You don't have to figure it out all at once," I said softly. "Sometimes it's okay to just be." His eyes lifted to meet mine, and I saw a flicker of something unspoken there, something that made my chest tighten. "It's hard," he admitted. "But when you're here, it feels like I can breathe a little easier." My heart thudded in my chest at his words, the vulnerability in his voice pulling me closer. "Ethan, you're not alone in this," I whispered, the space between us feeling impossibly small. "You don't have to go through it alone." For a moment, he simply looked at me, his gaze filled with an intensity that made my breath catch. There was a vulnerability in his expression, as though he was silently pleading for something he couldn't put into words. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly, he leaned closer, his hand tightening slightly around mine, the warmth of his touch grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. The room seemed to shrink around us, the edges of reality blurring until the world faded away, leaving nothing but the quiet connection between us. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a thunderous echo that filled the silence, and I couldn't help but be drawn into the depth of his gaze, the unspoken emotions that lingered there. The vulnerability in his voice made my chest ache, and I felt an overwhelming urge to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I found that the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached out, my fingers curling gently around his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips. The connection was small but grounding, an unspoken reassurance that I was there for him. Ethan looked up at me then, his eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't quite name, a mixture of trust, fear, and something deeper that made my breath hitch. His lips parted slightly as though he wanted to speak, but no words came, leaving us suspended in a fragile moment of quiet understanding. The air between us felt charged, each heartbeat echoing like a drum in the silence. In that instant, I knew this was more than just a fleeting gesture. It was a bridge across an emotional chasm neither of us had dared to traverse before. "I don't want to mess this up," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not going to mess anything up," I replied, my own voice soft and steady now. "Let me help you with what you were busy with, Ethan." For a moment, neither of us moved, the silence between us heavy and charged. And then, slowly, Ethan leaned in, his movements hesitant, almost uncertain, as though he were waiting for me to stop him. I didn't. His lips brushed against mine, tentative and feather-light, and I felt my heart skip a beat. The kiss was soft, almost hesitant, but it sent a warmth spreading through me that I couldn't ignore. My hands moved instinctively, one resting on his arm, while the other cupped his face, my fingers brushing against the faint stubble on his jaw. For a moment, the rest of the world fell away. There was no sound, no light, no time, just the warmth of his lips against mine, the steady thrum of my heartbeat, and the overwhelming sense of connection that filled the space between us. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads resting against each other, I felt a rush of emotions that I couldn't begin to untangle. There was confusion, yes, and fear, but also a deep, undeniable sense of brightness that I couldn't explain. I had helped him, and I could see that he enjoyed it. But still, I felt some regret. "Ethan," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is—" "I know," he said quickly, his voice trembling slightly. "I know it's complicated. I need you to know how I feel." My chest tightened at his words, and I exhaled shakily, my hand still resting against his arms. "This isn't something we can take lightly," I said softly, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "I'm not," he replied, his tone earnest. "I've thought about this a lot. I've tried to ignore it, to push it away, but I can't. You're the one person who makes me feel like I can be myself." His honesty was both heartbreaking and comforting, and I felt a pang of guilt for the emotions that stirred within me. This was uncharted territory, a fragile moment teetering on the edge of change. I wasn't sure where to go from here, but his vulnerability anchored me, pulling me closer to the unspoken bond we shared. But as I looked into his eyes, a mixture of fear and yearning mirrored in his gaze. I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't ignore what was happening between us. It was as if the unspoken had taken form, quietly demanding acknowledgement, no matter how daunting the consequences might be. "I care about you, Ethan," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly, "more than you probably realize. But we need to be careful. We need to think about what this means." He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "I know. I don't want to lose this, whatever this is. I don't want it to go away." "It doesn't have to," I said softly, my hands falling to rest in my lap. "But we have to take it slow. We have to be sure." Ethan nodded again, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," he said quietly. The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, and I offered him a small, tentative smile. "We'll figure it out," I said, my voice steady. "Together." Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time that evening, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The tension that had filled the room seemed to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding that while things might not be simple, we would face them together. As I stood to leave, Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against mine in a silent gesture of connection. I looked back at him, my heart swelling with a mixture of emotions I couldn't fully name, and I squeezed his hand gently before stepping out of the room. The hallway felt quieter now, the weight in the air lighter somehow. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as I made my way back to my room, I felt a sense of hope that I hadn't expected. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The rest of the night passed in restless fragments of thought. Sleep came in fleeting waves, and every time I closed my eyes, I found myself replaying our conversation, the vulnerability in Ethan's voice, and the weight of his words. By the time the first rays of sunlight spilled through my curtains, I knew there was no escaping the gravity of what had transpired. The morning was quiet, the house cloaked in an almost unnatural stillness. I moved through the motions of breakfast mechanically, the familiar rituals failing to ground me. My mind was elsewhere, tangled in the complexities of what Ethan and I had shared. As I sipped my coffee, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression a blend of hesitation and determination. "Morning," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken thoughts. "Morning," I replied, offering a tentative smile. The air between us felt different, charged with an energy that neither of us could fully articulate. Ethan hesitated for a moment before stepping into the kitchen. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone earnest. "Of course," I said, setting my mug down and gesturing for him to sit. He sat across from me, his hands clasped tightly together as though steadying himself. "I've been thinking about everything we said last night, about us." His voice wavered slightly, but his gaze remained steady. I nodded, my own heart pounding in anticipation. "Go on," I urged gently. "I meant every word," he said firmly. "But I also know how complicated this is. I just don't want to pretend it didn't happen. I need to know where we go from here." His honesty took my breath away, and for a moment, I struggled to find the right words. "Ethan, I'm not pretending either, but we have to be careful. We have to navigate this with thought and care. Whatever this is, it's important, and I don't want to hurt you, or anyone else." He nodded, his expression softening. "I'm willing to take it slow, to figure it out together." A wave of relief washed over me, and I reached across the table, placing my hand over his. "Then that's what we'll do," I said softly. "One step at a time." Ethan's lips curved into a small, grateful smile, and for the first time that morning, The tension in the room began to ease. As we sat there, the sunlight streaming in through the kitchen window, I felt a tentative sense of hope take root. Whatever lay ahead, we would face it together.